Houghton Mill, some call it Houghton Mill, in Huntingdonshire. It's one of our wonderful heritage sites in a wonderful rural setting, so much a part of our country. And we're here for a few days, and I must tell you that the last 2 days and 2 nights it has been pouring down with rain and very cold. This is the 4th of June and I'm just going to tell you now that we're here to talk about global warming. We're going to talk to the Reverend Philip Foster. He's a retired minister and he's done a lot of research. He will introduce himself and you can see his credentials. He's done a lot of research on this matter, and it's very crucial that we understand exactly what we're being told and the lies that we're being fed by unaccountable, unelected people with an agenda of their own. And I call this the Guide to Global Warming for Dummies and Sheeple. And please don't be offended by that. This is an extremely difficult subject to get your head round. We have a lot of information from so many various sources, and the Reverend Foster has really wonderfully given us a good, concise and clear précis of exactly what's going on, so that you can understand the lies and untruths that we're being fed. Because these people are on an agenda of their own. This is a political agenda, and the idea is to change our way of life so that we will never, ever recognise our country as it is now again. It's very, very serious, and we show you this mill as a reminder of the wonderful history and heritage of our country and the richness that we have, and it's all in danger. They're trying to take away our very identity, and global warming through sustainable development is another way of doing this. It's one of the tools that they have. Anyway, we'll go on over to Philip Foster now, and please listen to what he has to say. And as we keep saying, please investigate this for yourself, because you'll be very surprised and I hope shocked by what you find out.
Hello, my name's Philip Foster, and I'm just going to tell you a brief bit about myself before we move on to the topic of climate change and sustainable development, which is so very much today's topic. My background is in science. I did my first degree in natural science at Cambridge University, and then went out and taught for 6 years in Nigeria at a secondary and sixth form school. I returned from there and trained to be a Christian minister, which has been what I've been doing for the last 30 years. I'm now retired. That's just to put myself in the picture. I'm in one sense no important person, but equally I have taken time to study quite carefully the whole issue of global warming, climate change, and its connections with so-called sustainable development. Okay, let's look and see what this great issue of climate change / global warming is really about. Is it, in fact, a storm in a teacup? Here's my first graph. On this graph, you can see two things. One is the rise in carbon dioxide levels for the last 120 years. And secondly, the blue jagged line, the average global temperatures over that same period. Strictly speaking, this is actually a graph of the average temperatures over the whole of the United States, acting as a proxy for the globe. Not an unreasonable way of approaching it, because the USA landmass covers all kinds of different sorts of climate area. So it's a perfectly reasonable thing to do as a basic proxy. Now, looking at that graph straight away, it would seem fairly obvious that the CO2 rise and the temperature rise and fall are not really greatly related. And yet, those who are promoting climate change as being a worry suggest that there is a serious connection between the two. As you can see from the graph, for example, the hottest year was 1934, not 1998, as is so frequently alluded to. And also the warmest decade was the 1930s, not the 1990s. And currently, as we shall see later, temperatures are actually falling back. Well, there's the graph over which all this huge brouhaha is set up. But what about carbon dioxide rise? Is this the big deal it claims to be? Is CO2 a terrible pollutant? It is not. CO2 is a life-giving gas. You and I and all the world around us would not be here at all if there was no CO2 in the atmosphere. The amounts recorded on that chart are in fact very small amounts. They are measured in parts per million. CO2 is a very rare gas in the atmosphere. It is rarer than argon. And yet CO2 is responsible for all life on Earth. It gives life to plants. They are made of carbon dioxide, and indirectly and directly, you and I are also made of carbon dioxide and other things as well. The levels of carbon dioxide would have to rise to something like 5% of the atmosphere before they were seriously life-threatening. At the moment, they are 0.03%, and rising, yes, but not that greatly. So let's be clear then, CO2 itself is not a problem. In fact, it is causing, currently, this rise in CO2 is causing global vegetation to increase by 4% for every decade. You and I may have noticed it when we have to mow our lawns, that in fact you do have to mow them a little more often, because the grass grows rather better when there's CO2 around, as do the trees. So that's our first point. The second point to note about this graph is that the overall slight increase in temperature over the last 100 years or so is about 0.5 degrees centigrade. Let's get that into perspective. Here is that same graph put on a different scale. During an average day on Earth, some parts of the world experience a temperature change of 50 degrees centigrade, from below freezing to 40 or so in the hot sunshine, particularly in deserts. The little slim line that you can hardly see on the graph represents the change over the last 100 years, represented on this new axis of daily change of some 30 to 40 degrees. It's hardly noticeable. In other words, a change of 0.5 degree is not a deal to get particularly worried about anyway. But what about temperatures in the past? It's possible to work out from a number of what's called proxy measurements how temperatures have changed over, say, the last 1,000 years. And in fact, we can go back a very long way. But over the last 1,000 years, it's worth noting that there has been a very warm period between about 900 AD and 1300. During this period, Greenland was colonized by the Vikings. Eric the Red set sail, and indeed a Viking colony survived there for that period. They were farmers and fishermen, and they had cattle, and they managed to eke a living out of Greenland quite successfully until about 1300 or so, when temperatures began to drop. And by 1400 the colony was extinct. They died of starvation because the temperatures began to drop into the Little Ice Age, which follows, as you can see, a great dip, reaching its depths of coldness in around 1600 to 1700. And we only began to come out of that Little Ice Age in about 1850, where, as it were, you can see the graph crossing the line. So when people speak about an increase of 0.5 degree centigrade, the question is from what base? Answer: from one of the coldest periods in recent history. However, the IPCC published this graph. Now, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is a body under the auspices of the United Nations. Its origins, strange to say, was that of Mrs. Thatcher. Mrs. Thatcher in the 80s was doing battle with the miners. Coal as a fuel supply she considered a suspicious item, simply because it was at risk of not being available. Sir Crispin Tickell informed her of the greenhouse theory, that the use of fossil fuels was warming the planet. And Mrs. Thatcher seized on this as any politician might, as a useful moral basis for changing to nuclear as opposed to coal. And in order to promote this moral crusade, she set up the Hadley Centre, under the auspices of the Met Office, to set up their great supercomputers to investigate global warming. Indeed, she gave money to the Royal Society to prove it. Now, that's an interesting point. When politicians start getting involved in science, we have problems. Notice she gave them money to prove the greenhouse idea. Scientists are not in the business of proving an idea. They're in the business of proving or disproving an idea. We'll come to that in a minute. Anyway, the IPCC started to publish reports. They had great international meetings about climate change worries and began to publish reports. In the year 2000, a scientist called Dr. Michael Mann, a young enthusiast, claimed he had produced a graph which showed that there was no medieval warm period, nor was there a little ice age, but rather produced this graph whereby he shows that temperatures seem to flow slowly down from 1000 AD to about 1850, and then suddenly jerk up with an extraordinary rate of speed between 1850 and today. The argument was the Industrial Revolution kicked in, the CO2 was produced, and up shot the temperatures. It looked very impressive. The hockey stick, as it came to be called, was an iconic graph on charts and posters for the green movements because it showed how catastrophic the current supposed rise in temperature really was. However, there is a problem with this graph. Statisticians asked Dr. Michael Mann both for his data and for his computer algorithm whereby he had generated this graph from his supposed data. He was very reluctant to surrender that data. That shows a bad scientist. A scientist who is not prepared to have his data and his methods examined carefully by other scientists and critically by other scientists is no scientist. Peer review is vital in order that mistakes, errors, and fraud are not perpetrated on the general public. Now, I am in no position to know whether Dr. Michael Mann was fraudulent or simply incompetent. But the truth of the matter is that when these statisticians looked at his data and at his computer algorithm, they discovered that you could feed in telephone numbers and you would still generate a hockey stick. They also discovered that he had not understood ways of measuring temperature over these periods. He had used tree rings, in fact one tree ring data of a bristlecone pine in California to generate this sudden jerk of rise in temperature. He was in error because of a very simple fact, which I've already touched on. It is true that carbon dioxide has risen over this period. And one of the things that carbon dioxide does is to make trees grow very vigorously, particularly bristlecone pines. The tree rings certainly showed signs of increase because of the CO2, not because of the temperature. He was in error, but he was in charge of the entire IPCC report of the year 2000. And he was in charge of producing the summary that they produce for policymakers. This is their great bullet point of the, as it were, the distillation of all the research papers they've collected together. Unfortunately, these summaries bear no relation to the science they purport to summarize. They always point in the direction of human intervention in climate causing disaster. So Michael Mann was the perfect candidate for this. Here he was, showing that this was the case, and so he was put in charge of the whole thing. He was a young activist, not particularly responsible, nor particularly good scientist, as we have seen. Yet he was in charge of the whole thing. And yet they claim that this is the consensus of thousands of scientists across the globe. One of the many causes of alarm created by the IPCC is the claim that global warming will increase the severity of hurricanes and other extreme weather phenomena. The IPCC itself, however, has its own scientific papers which demonstrate that the opposite is the case. The chart you can see, the bar chart, is of hurricane strikes in the Atlantic on the American coastline over the last 100 years. As you can see from that bar chart, The maximum number of hurricane strikes took place in about 1940. And indeed, the number of strikes has steadily fallen since then. It's not easy to predict the rate at which hurricane strikes will increase or decrease, but over this period, the evidence is reasonably clear that actually hurricane strikes have gone down, not gone up, over the last few decades. In a similar vein, tornadoes, a good example again of extreme weather conditions, show a peak in 1975, but have clearly gone down since then to 2005. One of the ways in which the alarm is created, however, is by a fallacious use of statistics. What is usually mentioned is the cost and damage of hurricane strikes and tornado strikes. But this has got nothing to do with their severity, but everything to do with real estate prices. If you build your real estate on the edge of the Atlantic, where you're likely to be hit by a tornado or by a hurricane, then indeed it'll cost a lot of money to replace it, and your insurance costs will be high. But if you don't, they won't be. So the general pattern is that weather, in fact, has got less extreme over the last few decades, not more extreme. Let's go back to the Michael Mann versus reality temperature graph. Above is another version of the hockey stick, where the medieval warm period has disappeared and the cold period has also vanished from his graph. But in reality, these both exist. We have good, solid historical evidence. We have good, solid paleographic... I'm going to have to start that again. Here we see the two graphs again, the hockey stick, unreality, and the true picture below with the medieval warm period and the Little Ice Age clearly portrayed, for which we have good, solid historical evidence and also good, solid scientific evidence. For example, in the medieval warm period, vineyards flourished in Yorkshire. In the very cold period, there were ice fairs on the River Thames because it was so cold and the Thames froze over. So we have good evidence, and there's plenty more. That's just a sample of it. But where does this greenhouse idea come from anyway? What is it in terms of scientific ideas? It is what scientists call a hypothesis. And a hypothesis is simply a hunch. A scientist has an idea as to what might be the cause of a certain phenomenon. If it's a good hunch, it should produce a means whereby you test your hypothesis. You have an idea, you think it might be the case, therefore you do experiments to show whether it's true or false. This is important. Scientists test a hypothesis not just to find out if it's true, but also to find out if it may be false, because you might then need either to throw the hypothesis away or at least modify it in view of the evidence. The enhanced greenhouse hypothesis, to give it its full name, is the idea that human emissions of CO2 from industry and from burning fossil fuels is causing the current, well, it's not that current, but the last 30 years of slight warming. It is a hypothesis, a hunch, and there's nothing wrong with that as a scientific idea in the first place. The idea is simple enough. We're all familiar with the greenhouse effect. If we sit in a hot car on a sunny day, we know exactly what we mean if the windows are shut. The car warms up rapidly because hot energy from the sun enters through the glass of the windows of the car, warms up the seats and the car, but the seats radiate the energy back out, which reflects back off the glass, back into the car, causing this greenhouse effect. Here's an example of it on the pictures. You see the greenhouse surface warming up and the whole atmosphere inside the greenhouse gets warmer. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere acts just a little bit like the glass of the greenhouse, but not exactly, because instead of reflecting the energy back, it absorbs the energy being radiated from the surface of the Earth and therefore should warm up the atmosphere. Clouds, on the other hand, reflect sunlight, particularly the tops of clouds. Most of us who have travelled in aeroplanes above the clouds will notice how bright white the cloud cover often is from above, because it's reflecting back vast amounts of sunlight and sun heat, so that the area underneath becomes cooler. Clouds in general, particularly the low-level clouds that we are thinking about, are net coolers of the planet. But CO2 does absorb energy and should, in theory, slightly warm up the atmosphere if temperatures are rising. The theory, or the hypothesis, predicted two things: that the effect of this warming would be greatest at the poles, and secondly, the air would warm up quicker than the ground. And we're going to look at these two quite quickly. Number one, and this is the first blow to the hypothesis, neither of these predictions actually turned out to be occurring. I know we've heard a lot about the Arctic ice melting and the Antarctic melting. We need to understand this rather more carefully. In fact, the Antarctic is getting colder. The central landmass of the Antarctic is actually getting thicker with ice. This is a fact. And you need to remember that 90% of the Earth's land-based ice is in the Antarctic. Less than 8% is in Greenland, and the rest is distributed over glaciers across the globe. But something like 90% of the Earth's landlocked ice is on Antarctica, and it's getting thicker. The little bit you usually see on the map sticking out towards South America, the Antarctic Peninsula, is a tiny, tiny portion of the whole landmass. Antarctica is as big as South America. It's a huge landmass, but that little bit is tiny. It is true that parts of that area is getting warmer, but that is almost certainly due to local currents of the oceans in the area and nothing to do with any general global warming. The North Pole is a more complicated picture, but Greenland itself is actually also increasing in ice in its main landmass. The Arctic melts and contracts and also expands. It varies enormously, and NASA has clear pictures of this happening. And in general, it is true that the ice on the globe has been melting for the last 10,000 years. This is not surprising. We left a big ice age about 11,000 years ago, and ice is naturally slowly melting. Is it a big deal? No. Will it affect global ocean levels? Just a little. Approximately 6 inches for every century. And it has not changed. There is no evidence that sea levels are rising any faster than they have done for hundreds of years. So we need to understand, first of all, then, that we are being told untruths about the Arctic and the Antarctic. They are not actually a problem. Glaciers are, in some places, retreating, and in other places, extending. Ask an alpine farmer which of the two he happens to prefer, an expanding glacier or a contracting one. And the answer is obvious. He prefers a contracting one. An expanding glacier is like a billion-ton bulldozer walking through his village. There's nothing you can do to stop it. So looking at the temperature chart again, we're getting familiar with this picture of CO2 and temperature. If we look at the period between about 1942 or 3 and 1970, when overall the temperature went down, that was a time when CO2 was rapidly rising after the war as industrialization really took off. So clearly here, certainly, there is no connection between CO2 levels and temperature rise. The second blow to the theory, as this has just shown, is that warming does not follow increases in CO2. The Earth cooled, though CO2 was rising. Third blow. It didn't explain the past warm periods. The Roman warm period, so warm that there is evidence they were growing vineyards up in Chester and even beyond Hadrian's Wall. And the medieval warm period, where, as we said before, there were vineyards in Yorkshire, and it was a time actually of prosperity and growth and free labour because of the building of the great cathedrals and so on. Then, still thinking of the blows, in the fourth blow is the fact that NASA report that most of the solar system has been warming up over the last few decades. Ice is melting, or caps are melting in Mars. Some of the moons of Jupiter are showing signs of warming. Now, that seriously cannot be due to human emissions of CO2. We haven't got that far, unless you consider the Voyager program as a danger to CO2 levels. Then the fifth blow, which really is the death blow. Al Gore, in his infamous film, An Inconvenient Truth, claims that the ice core records prove that CO2 causes warming. Unfortunately, he ought to have known better. The ice core samples, drilling down through the ice caps in Greenland and also in the Antarctic, show the opposite. The ice core analysis certainly did show that when temperatures rose, carbon dioxide levels also rose. But what the analysis actually showed was that that was the order in which these things happened. First, for whatever reason, the temperature on Earth began to rise. Then, with a lag of perhaps 500 to 800 years, the CO2 levels in the atmosphere also began to rise, following the warming, not causing the warming. Then they come to us and tell us that the computer models show the disastrous effect of CO2 emissions in the atmosphere, predicting anything from 3 to 10 degrees rise in temperature in the next 50 to 100 years. We need to understand a little bit about computer modeling. Computers can only bring out what you put into them. Computers are only as good as the information they receive. There is an old computer statement: garbage in, garbage out. And the truth is that despite the huge expense and the huge power of the supercomputer models that model climate, that is the fact. Garbage in, garbage out. They feed in the idea that CO2 causes global warming. They add in the effect that clouds and CO2 together will produce even more warming, and then tell us the computer models predict there is more warming. The only trouble is the computer models have been consistently wrong. Badly wrong, out by several 100% in their predictions. Here's an example. They're supposed to be able to predict cloud cover. Cloud cover is the most vital factor in global warming or cooling. On the map, on the graph, it's a little bit tricky to see. The heavy black line shows cloud cover over an observed period as a percentage from the North Pole, 90 degrees north, to the South Pole, 90 degrees south, going through the equator. The thin, hairy lines that you see are what the computer models predict about cloud cover. They are wildly inaccurate. The general trend is there, but then that's not difficult to do. But they are so far out as to be hopelessly inaccurate and hopelessly useless in terms of saying this is what the climate is doing. In fact, the Hadley Centre admitted only the other day that although the computer models are very clever at producing wonderful graphics of how the atmosphere might work, they had to say that they were now trying to work so that the computer models could actually predict the climate. After 30 years and vast expense, they tell us, even themselves, that the computer models are telling porkies. Well, if CO2 is not causing global warming, and there has been some global warming and fluctuations of global temperature, what is causing it? The sun. Is that a surprise? No, I don't think it is. And yet, the IPCC refuses to allow research into the effect of the sun on the planet's climate. When this was raised by serious scientists that this was an important area of research, it was dismissed as irrelevant. The only thing the IPCC was interested in was the supposed link between CO2 and so-called global warming or climate change. But the sun is the key. not surprisingly. There would be no weather at all if there was no sun. In fact, we of course wouldn't be here. What we need to understand about the sun is that it is not an absolutely constant body. In fact, as somebody described it very clearly, if you could see it in X-ray eyes or with gamma ray eyes, it is a raging tiger. The magnetic field of the sun, which fluctuates, has doubled over the last century and is now dimming off again. The planet Earth actually orbits within what one might describe as the atmosphere of the sun, sometimes called the solar wind, which blows out particles and all kinds of things way beyond the orbit of Pluto. The sun varies in its intensity, not by much, perhaps a few points of a percent. Ebbs and flows. There are periods of higher activity and lower activity. These periods are not absolutely regular, but there is an 11-year sunspot cycle, a 20-year cycle, an 80-year cycle, a 400-year cycle, and possibly a 1500-year cycle, and maybe more. But again, these are approximate. We can't predict them with certainty. But when there are high sunspots, the sun is particularly active, and this is an interesting phenomenon. When the sun is hotter, the sun shields the Earth through its solar wind from cosmic radiation that comes to us from all over the galaxy. Cosmic radiation are tiny charged fragments of bits of atoms that are the shrapnel from supernovas. When suns explode, they spew this cosmic radiation throughout the galaxy. The very high energy particles that come flying through us, and in fact probably while I've been speaking, perhaps a few dozen have gone through your body even as we speak, are key to the vital factor in the Earth's climate. For example, malaria, not many people realize, is not a tropical disease as such, but has spread far north into Europe and beyond. Speaking of Britain, in the area where I am at the moment, malaria was only wiped out in 1954 and in parts of Holland in 1970. Malaria is not a tropical disease, and it would not be affected by warming or cooling in the same way that other diseases would not be. One of the major causes of deaths from malaria is often poverty, and that is why Africa faces such terrible troubles from malaria. It was also true why in Russia in the 1920s there was a terrible outbreak, probably the worst in the world, of malaria, which reached as far north as Siberia and Archangel. So malaria is not a problem to do with climate change, and nothing to worry about in that sense, but more to worry about in terms of wiping it out in areas of great poverty. One of the big disasters was the banning, or effective banning, of DDT, which was one of the most effective insecticides. The result of banning it has probably been responsible for 50 million deaths. This goes back to Rachel Carson and her book Silent Spring, where she promoted this whole idea that pesticides were necessarily wicked. And as a result, 30 to 50 million people have died as a result of her book. Now, I'm not accusing her of doing it on purpose. She meant well. But meaning well is a dangerous thing if you don't know what you are doing and don't know what you're talking about. And far too many people in this area are of that ilk. They think they are doing the right thing. They think that that's what they should be doing. But the trouble is they do not know because they are ill-informed. Not being informed can result in disastrous, though well-intentioned, activities. The banning, as I said, of DDT is now disastrously too late because the mosquitoes began to become resistant and now it is far less effective than it could have been. But that is another story. But behind all this lies this whole sustainable development caper. The idea that somehow we must get back to nature, we must get back to the peasant way of life. That's usually said by people who have no idea what peasant life was like, and indeed what it is like if you go to third world countries, where it is a constant, miserable grind of trying to eke out a daily existence. And the idea that we want to inflict that as a solution to the world's problems is outrageous. It's outrageous on behalf of the poor who are going to suffer most. In fact, it has to be said, and this is not a reflection on the poor I am talking about, but the environments that cause such concern are most affected by those who are poor, because they have to cut and destroy just to live day by day. They haven't got electricity, they haven't got fuels that are safe, they haven't got food that can be stored in refrigerators, because these things have been banned. The effect of changing the refrigerant in refrigerators for fear of affecting the ozone layer caused again millions of deaths, because refrigerators could have been used in third world countries were then scrapped and drained of their refrigerant. This was a pointless exercise and a useless one, and yet the results were catastrophic. So we need to be aware that there is an agenda which is wholly unreal in terms of what it can do. The idea that we go back to a primitive time when things were sunny and nice is not true. Ask anyone who has to live a subsistence living. To quote C.S. Prakash, who is an agrobiologist from Pakistan and well respected, he stated, "Organic farming," he said, "is sustainable. It sustains poverty and malnutrition." That is not the way forward, but it is the way forward if you want to see half the world die. And I fear there are those who are not well-meaning who have that intention. Carrying on then with this from malaria, as we've seen, actually straightforward dealing with malaria, mosquito nets, use of insecticides and health information could save 20 billion infections and save millions of lives for a very reasonable cost. Poverty, big anxiety apparently of the UN. Well, Kyoto might, even if it worked, save perhaps 1 million fewer from poverty. However, sensible, smart solutions could take 1 billion people out of poverty quite easily at very low cost if it was directed properly. The same is true of starvation. Yeah, Kyoto might, just might, if the wind was in the right direction, do something. But sensible activity would do a great deal more. From here on the list that Lomborg has, Kyoto can do nothing. But there are vital issues that are not being addressed. HIV/AIDS, which is a huge problem for whatever the reasons. Nonetheless, reasonable spending could save 3.5 million lives a year. Micronutrients, simple vitamins in food for those who struggle with malnutrition could be averted 1 billion plus for a very small input of $3 billion. Free trade, granted a complicated issue, but nonetheless essentially a way of getting wealth to the developing countries, could help enormously by inputting a huge amount of money into the economies of the third world. Today we're hearing a desire to ban the sending of vegetables by air from Kenya to Britain or to Europe because it uses up fuel. But that means that Kenyan farmers can no longer earn hard currency because it will be banned, and they're pushed back into their subsistence farming. Drinking water and sanitation, basic rights, it seems to me, for ordinary human beings. Once again, Kyoto does nothing, but by just the payment of 4 billion, you'd give 3 billion people access to drinking water and sanitation. That's a huge number of people. Yep, if you're worried about the climate and you want a carbon tax, fair do, but use the research and development money sensibly. Towards a low carbon, yeah, you can find alternative sources of energy, fine, but do it sensibly. It's interesting that the Green Party are never interested in real solutions to problems. They simply want there to be a problem so that they can then point the finger and say it's all our fault. The price tag for feel good, if you remember, was $180 billion a year of your and my money. Lomborg would propose a budget of 52 billion a year, but the dramatic difference in the effect that this money makes is already clear before you.
Now you've mentioned Kyoto here. Can you tell us exactly what it is? I believe it's a treaty that was signed a while ago.
Yes, that's right. It was a treaty that originated from the first of the UN global summits at Rio. The background to it is complex and the results are complex. But in essence, what it was that Rio, originally a kind of green jamboree, suddenly caught the attention of the politicians because they realized they had green constituencies within their governments and within their voters. And they realized if they were not on board with this new green sustainable development, caper, they might lose votes. This was particularly true in Europe, where the system of parties is such that often Greens might hold a balance of power. And so it became necessary to appease the Green movement, even though its views and ideas were becoming more and more outlandish. And so they went along to Rio and decided, as politicians have a habit of doing, that they would make some grand gestures of commitment about cutting carbon and all the rest of it. Of course, as with all politicians who think only for the next headline, they tended to make these promises for 20 years or 30 years in the future when they knew they wouldn't be around to have to feel the result. And so Kyoto was started. And the idea was to cut back to a subsistence economy, to put it crudely, if the Greens had their way. And this would mean elimination of all sorts of things that we would take for granted, including, it seems, private property, and rationing and all kinds of things, and the introduction of organic farming. And it comes back to the idea that really the agenda is to cut the population of the world down. It is unsustainable, the dreadful word, that there are too many people. So cut it down. So this was the beginning of this hysteria which was stirred up by the Green Party, which by that time had become a Marxist infiltrated organisation anyway, who were anti-capitalist as well as anti-industry. And again, to quote the co-founder of Greenpeace, he realized that his organization had been taken over by people who had no real interest in the issues of conservation or sensible use of the planet, but were extreme. So much so, he realized that when he left, they were actually seeking to ban the element chlorine from the world. And as he ruefully pointed out, that isn't exactly within human remit. It is one of the elements of the periodic table. So we were dealing with a hysterical, activist, fanatical group who had unfortunately caught the ear of our politicians, who in turn, in order to maintain their constituencies, saw it the way of going along with it. But also behind that, they could see that there was a useful agenda that could use these people in turn to bring about the end of having a global government, because the environment crosses state boundaries. The atmosphere crosses state boundaries. Therefore, it has to be dealt with by global legislation and paid for by global taxation. We see that acting, of course, in the European Union, which is the kind of sort of model example of how to do it. You may laugh. But indeed it is. It is pushing this agenda like anything. They want to cut emissions 50%, which is ridiculous. It means going back to before the time of the Industrial Revolution. They have no idea the consequences, or perhaps they do, of what they are trying to push. And we're going to be facing these consequences if we live long enough in our own lifetimes.
It's a very interesting point you're making here about the hurricanes and tornadoes not being as bad as they were. It does come to mind here that the government here in the UK is actually advocating building on floodplains. And I wonder about your comments on that, and also about the Katrina incident. What would you say about that?
Yes, well, the fact that you build in a floodplain and then complain that you're flooded is clearly kind of odd, that people should complain. The government, of course, bless its heart, doesn't have such thing as joined up government anyway. It's desperate to build more houses. Land on floodplains is cheap, therefore, of course, you start building. The fact that there have been floods in Britain in the last couple of years has nothing to do, of course, with global warming, despite what they'd like to say. In 2007, when there were severe floods, the Hadley Centre and the Met Office released their weather forecast, long range so-called, for that year, which was going to be hot, warm and dry. Well, it turned out to be slightly different to that, a little damp and not very warm. And yet, when these floods happened, they of course crazily said, oh well, it's due to global warming. This is typical of the global warmists, that any weather, whatever it is, it must be blamed on global warming. There was snow in Jerusalem this year. Well, that's global warming. There is ice somewhere. That's global warming. It's a kind of knee-jerk crazy reaction to reinforce the sense that global warming is the cause of all our problems. In fact, and I will touch on this, I touched on it earlier, Professor Richard Lindzen, who is probably the world's leading climate expert at MIT in America, points out that if global warming were to really take hold, and if the poles really did melt, which is what it would supposedly do, then the key factor that causes extreme weather, such as causes floods, is by definition reduced, because it's the temperature difference between the tropics and the poles that makes for stormy weather. In a global warming situation, the poles warm up much more than the tropics. The tropics tend to get wetter, but the poles get warmer. And as a result, the temperature difference is dropping, thus reducing the likelihood of stormy weather. The fact that we had a cold summer may well be the cause of the floods. And it has nothing to do with the fact that we're having global warming. In fact, it's probably connected with the fact there is slight global cooling. However, to go back to this business of the hurricanes anyway, Katrina was made much of as the wickedness of human beings causing global warming. Hurricane Katrina was not a very severe hurricane. It was only category 3. What the problem was is it hit some very big real estate called New Orleans. New Orleans was built on not only a floodplain, was built below sea level, as are places in Holland and places in Britain too. Not surprisingly, a sea surge would have devastating results, particularly in view of the fact that the sea defences were not very effective. So in a sense they were asking for trouble, and had been ever since New Orleans was founded. And the fact that it happened to hit, they've been very lucky not to be hit so far, and it has nothing to do with global warming.
You were mentioning alternative energies earlier on, sensible alternative energies. And myself, not being an advocate of wind farms, having seen acres and acres of our wonderful countryside here covered in them, I wonder what your views are on them.
Yes, wind farms are, I can only say, a colossal scam. The point about wind farms is that although they generate some electricity, it is intermittent. And there's nothing more helpless and useless than lights that keep going on and off. When, they say a wind generator generates, let's say, 1 megawatt of electricity, that would be what it would generate if it was running 100% of the time. But in fact, it only will run for about 25% of the time, intermittently, and not when you want it. As a result, you have to, and I underline this, you have to build an equivalent standard power station to back up the wind farm. In other words, a coal-fired power station to the same amount as the wind farm claims to produce must be built. Otherwise, you will have blackouts. Therefore, it seems to me crazy that on the one hand you waste money on wind farms and at the same time have to pay out for a standard power station. Why not just stop bothering with the wind farms, which are doing no good, ruining the scenery, chopping up birds, which people seem to love. They're absolutely bird mincers, they really are. They break, they are dangerous to shipping out at sea, they're a danger to all kinds of things on land, they ruin the scenery, and the only thing they do is to enrich the people who are building them, for they get huge subsidies from the European Union, from government, from your taxes and from mine, and then a second subsidy from the excess we have to pay on our electricity bills to pay for these wind farms as well. So we pay for them twice, once in our taxes and once through our utility bills, and for nothing. It is really money for something that doesn't work. Solar power, of course, is a complete waste of time. The alternatives, such as nuclear, have some sense to them. I mean, obviously there are problems with nuclear, but they're not that great. Again, great scares are put out as to how dangerous the waste is and so on. But in fact, a good nuclear power station certainly is a sensible thing to build, just for practical reasons anyway. The French run 80% of their power in France is nuclear. I think we're much less than 20%, I think, here. If you want to avoid CO2 emissions, then nuclear is the logical way to go. Hopefully, one could move on to fusion, but that's something they don't give enough research to anyway, which would not have the waste products of conventional fission stations. But anyway, there's plenty of coal, plenty of gas, and they work perfectly well. Our problem in Britain is likely to be, I think, rolling blackouts, because we have not been replacing power stations that we need. Instead, we've been wasting money on wind power, which won't work. So we've got a real problem, and we're creating a problem for ourselves. We had, in fact, only the other day, 2 power stations went down simultaneously, and a large area of London and the southeast was blacked out because there was no backup.
I've read some really good articles about the wind power by Christopher Booker, and I believe it's in his book, isn't it, with Dr. Richard
Yes.
North?
In fact, I can flag that up. Scared to Death, a book North and Booker put together, which is available again on Amazon, Continuum Press. From BSE to global warming, how scares are costing us the earth in every sense. I would thoroughly recommend that book to anyone.
I've been reading the Christopher Booker notebook online, and he's got some really good stuff about the wind power statistics and a lot of scientific stuff there, if anybody wants to check that out.
Yes, I always recommend Christopher Booker. He's always well informed and takes trouble because he must be a prime target for being fed, as it were, the wrong thing, because they do not like him in Brussels. I am told, though I have no proof, they have a whole department trying to deal with him.
I can believe that.
But he's a difficult man to deal with because he checks his sources, and he and North, between them, they do good research.
Right. This is something that we say when we do our films to people out there in internet land. You don't have to believe what we're telling you. We really don't. Go out there, check it out for yourself.
Yeah, I mean, here am I sitting on my own, talking to you, spouting my stuff, and I haven't given footnotes as to where I got all this material, but it is all up front and available either in books or on the internet, and it's respectable sources. I'm not trotting out the people from the weird and wonderful lunatic fringe. Maybe that's what people think I am, but it's not like that. This is the real science, and the real science is simply saying that the whole global warming issue is not an issue. And there are plenty of other things that we should get concerned about, but global warming is not one of them.
You mentioned Bjorn Lomborg earlier on. Can you tell us who he is?
Yes, indeed. And while I'm at it, I'll recommend another one of his books, which he published originally in 2002, though I believe on the internet he keeps this up to date. It's called The Skeptical Environmentalist. Bjorn Lomborg is an associate professor of statistics at the Department of Political Science in the University of Aarhus in Denmark. Strangely, he can write a book about statistics, which is interesting. For most of us, I think the word statistics is the biggest turn-off in the book, but actually he makes it interesting and informative. The origin of the Skeptical Environmentalist is itself interesting. Bjorn was a Greenpeace activist in the 70s and came across an article by a professor of economics called Julian Simon. Julian Simon was challenging Ehrlicher and others of the environmental movement about their doom-laden predictions of running out of oil or running out of resources by about 1985. Interestingly, there's a prophetic statement that never came true. They were always moving the date on, like Jehovah's Witnesses, when we were going to run out of everything. Anyway, this article challenged Ehrlicher and others to a bet. Julian Simon challenged them to say they could choose any 5 commodities they wanted. Be it tin, oil, cotton, you name it, they could choose it. Any basket of 5. For any period of time they cared to name, and he bet them $10,000 that in that time the real value of those commodities would have fallen. In other words, their availability would have increased, not decreased. They thought money for old rope and took him on. They chose, I can't remember all the details, certain metals, cotton, 1 or 2 other things, and they chose a period of 10 years. And they thought they were home and dry for $10,000. They lost. Bjorn Lomborg read this article, and he too was quite indignant. He felt, surely this economist can't be right. Surely the world is in a terrible state and we're running out of everything. So he and his students sat down to research what Julian had said as to whether it was true or false. And the outcome of it was this book, The Skeptical Environmentalist. And in it, basically, he assesses the state of the planet in terms of its material resources, not its spiritual resources. That's a different issue. But basically, he was saying that the planet is in, well, remarkably good shape. Things have greatly improved over the last 150 years. Pollution has gone down enormously. Resources have increased. Poverty has amazingly decreased. Starvation has decreased. It's a remarkable range of things. He's not saying that all is wonderful in the garden. In fact, he says very clearly in his first chapter, he says, I want to stress that although things are improving, they are by no means good enough. And he says that's a vital distinction to make. But in the book, he assesses all these things and shows the facts and figures, not his own, but figures that are universally accepted, showing that on the whole, the state of the planet has been improvement in most areas. Clearly, there are things that can be done to improve it more. And here is where the Copenhagen Consensus comes in. You can Google that. And Lomborg runs these conferences of drawing together experts, economists, and so forth, agriculturalists in the fields of the areas of difficulty, and tries to assess a sensible policy and a way forward at reasonable cost. And his book is influential. It was published by the Cambridge University Press, which is no mean organisation. And according to Time magazine, he is one of the 100 most influential people. I don't know whether he would accept that or whether that's true. I wish it was. But anyway, that's something about who Bjorn Lomborg is and about his books, which I would commend.
You were telling us about the IPCC organisation. Seems to me it's an awful lot of scientists who are now ruling our lives. Can you tell us more about this?
Yes, I'll do my best. The IPCC, which is one of these initials for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, came out of the Rio Summit in 1990. But as I touched on earlier, has its origins with Mrs. Thatcher and the Hadley Centre as the sort of seat of supposed expertise on climate. But essentially, this is a highly political and politicised body. It comes under the auspices of the United Nations and essentially is ruled and run by Sir John Houghton, who is its main chairman, and also a person called Mark Bolin, who was the first person to promote the idea of greenhouse warming. But it is essentially political, a gathering of NGOs and others who have an axe to grind, a political purpose to pursue. And the scientists are usually simply drafted in to prepare reports. And when an IPCC report comes out, you have a thing of 3 or 4 telephone directories of reports, great stash of them, and then a summary for policymakers, which is a kind of abstract from these reports that says the key things. And I've touched on before that these abstracts, which are the ones that the politicians read and the press reads, bear no relation whatever to any of the science that might be contained within the actual heavy-duty reports. Some of which is probably okay, but not all of it by a long chalk. Because in fact, although they often claim huge scientific support for their work, it seldom is the case. I'd like to quote, if I may, from testimony of Professor Paul Reiter, who is probably one of the world's leading experts in tropical diseases, particularly vector-borne diseases like malaria, before the House of Lords, who were looking into the reliability of the IPCC, and I might say that the report concluded that they were not very reliable. Anyway, he has this to say. He was on the part of the report that was involved with the effect on diseases of supposed climate change. And I'm going to have to read some of the things he says. He said this chapter on human population health as a result of climate change appeared at a critical period of the climate change debate. Fully 1/3 was devoted to mosquito-borne diseases, principally malaria. The chapter had a major impact on the public debate, because of course headlines, you're going to get malaria next week, makes a good headline, and is quoted even today, despite the more informed chapter of the third assessment. See you later. The scientific literature on mosquito-borne diseases is voluminous, yet the text references in the chapter was restricted to a handful of articles, many of them relatively obscure, and nearly all suggesting an increase in prevalence of disease in a warmer climate. In other words, what he is saying is that although there was a huge amount of material they could have drawn on, they did not draw on it, but only selected those that suggested that warmer climates would increase infection. The paucity of information was hardly surprising. Now listen to this carefully. Not one of the lead authors had ever written a research paper on the subject. So here we have a supposedly globally influential body running a report on something globally important as the spread of diseases, being headed up by people who knew nothing at all about the subject. Moreover, two of the authors, both physicians, had spent their entire career as environmental activists. So in other words, they were not acting as scientists, they were acting as activists on this group, which was supposed to be scientific. One of these activists has published, quote, professional articles as a, quote, expert on 32 different subjects, ranging from mercury poisoning to landmines, globalization to allergies, and West Nile virus to AIDS. In other words, a jack of all trades and a master of none. Among the contributing authors, there was one professional entomologist and a person who had written an obscure article on dengue fever and the El Nino, but whose principal interest was the effectiveness of motorcycle crash helmets, plus one paper on the health effects of cell phones. These are the experts in which the whole world is appearing to change its policies. Experts in crash helmets? I'm sorry, the IPCC is a shambles in terms of its scientific input. Yes, there are some good scientists, doubtless, who write papers for them, but they're the ones who are never listened to. Paul Reiter is a case in point. He was the only person on the committee who knew anything about tropical diseases, and everything he said was totally ignored. So much so that eventually he decided to resign. When he did resign, and yet the report came out with his name on it, he then went to them and objected and said, I did not contribute to this report. They said, oh, well, you did contribute because you were present. He said, well, nobody listened to anything I said. And they still said, well, we're going to keep your name on. He finally apparently had to threaten them with legal action to get his name removed. Now, if he had to do that and he was persistent, think of the other 2,500 scientists supposedly supporting it who haven't the time or the energy or the persistence to get their names removed. Because that is the truth of the matter. We're dealing with a body who are fraudulent in the way that they misuse real scientists and simply have the activists saying their thing and doing their thing without any expert. Just here, to summarize from point 19, this is in Hansard. If you want to pursue it, you can pursue that evidence through Hansard. He says a whole lot of pronouncements they made, all of which were unsound, about disease. He says, these confident pronouncements, untrammeled by details of the complexity of the subject and the limitations of these models they were using, were widely quoted as the consensus of 1,500 of the top world scientists. Occasionally the number quoted was 2,500. This clearly did not apply to the chapter on human health. Yet at the time, 8 out of 9 major websites that I checked placed these diseases at the top of the list of adverse impacts of climate change, quoting the IPCC. The issue of consensus, I'm continuing with his testimony, is key to understanding the limitations of IPCC pronouncements. Consensus is the stuff of politics, not of science. Science proceeds by observation, hypothesis, and experiment. Professional scientists rarely draw firm conclusions from a single article, but consider its contribution in the context of other publications and their own experience, knowledge, and speculations. The complexity of this process and the uncertainties involved are a major obstacle to meaningful scientific understanding of issues by non-scientists. So basically he's saying science is not so simple as the IPCC would love to make out, and certainly that what the IPCC trots out is not science. I could go on, there's plenty more he has to say about it. But if that's what happened in one department, it's clearly what was happening in the other departments as well. So we're dealing with an organisation who purports to be scientific, but is in fact political, who is promoting what can only be described as plain junk science and calling it real science. Be cautious about using the word junk science. There is an excellent website, junkscience.com, which I would actually commend to you. They deal with these issues, in other words, dealing with junk science as opposed to real science.
Now, you've recommended some books to us, very good for our own research. Can you show them to us again just quickly and tell us where we can get hold of them?
Yeah, sure. I'll run through them in no particular order, simply as they come off the pile. Paul Driesen, Eco-Imperialism, Green Power, Black Death. Hold that up so you can see it. You should be able to get this on Amazon. Just key in the title and Paul Driesen, D-R-I-E-S-S-E-N. That's available on Amazon. Distributed by Merrill Press in America. So that's that. Then the DVD, The Great Global Warming Swindle, WAG TV, produced for Channel 4. Again, I can supply that, or it is available, obviously, if you key in on the internet. And I would commend their website, which has articles on this issue, www.greatglobalwarmingswindle.com. Quite easy to remember, though quite long.
And can you give us your details?
I'll give the details in a minute when I've finished running through, because one or two of the others I also keep. Then one of the books by Bjorn Lomborg, I'll turn that way, because then you can read the title, and then that way to read the author. This is Marshall Cavendish, published last year. Again, you can get that on the internet. From August, I believe it should be available in paperback. So I gather. Of 2008, that is. Then I would commend, as I have before, Scared to Death. This is by Booker and North, published by Continuum. Again, the internet, Amazon, whatever, you should be able to key in and get that. I would commend that. Again, that was last year, published last year. Then my rather tacky copy of The Great Global Warming Swindle by Singer and Avery. I can supply that from St. Matthew Publishing, but also, again, you can get it on Amazon. You might do better than you can from me. It's published by Roman and Littlefield, and that was published, I think, in 2007. It was, yes. So they're all recent, very up-to-date, as is this one, The Chilling Stars, by Nigel Calder and Henrik Svensmark. Svensmark is a Danish physicist and cloud researcher. He was the one who put together the cosmic ray theory. This is published by Icon Books. I can supply that from St. Matthew Publishing. Again, obviously, you can get it on the internet as well. This is a really exciting book. I've not often sat on the edge of my chair as I was reading the result of an experiment they were conducting as to what the answer was going to be, but I was with this one. Nigel Calder used to be editor of The New Scientist and is a freelance science journalist. As I said, Svensmark, a physicist. Then another book by Bjorn Lomborg, an earlier book, The Skeptical Environmentalist. I spent a bit of time talking about that. Cambridge University Press, once again, should be available in most bookshops. Amazon, etc. And lastly, but not visibly, Lord Lawson of Blaby, Nigel Lawson, the old Chancellor of the Exchequer under Mrs. Thatcher at one point, has written a new book called An Appeal to Reason. It's only 100 pages long, plenty of excellent footnotes and pointers to research, an excellent summary of the whole global warming caper, its economic, moral and ethical consequences. And I would commend that. Published by Duckworth for about £9, I think. So that would be commendable. Very commendable book.
And how can we get hold of you at St Matthew's Publishing?
I think the easiest way would be by telephone, and it's British code 01480 399 098. Or you can email me, if you can follow this, at pf.smp @dial.pipex.com. That's pf, Peter Foxtrot, .smp, sugar mother Peter, @dial, as in telephone, .pipex, pipex.com.
And that's your own publishing company.
And it's my own publishing company. Some of these books, I didn't publish them, but I carry them because I think they are important and relevant.
That's excellent. Well, thank you so much for doing this for us today. We've actually tried here to correlate for you a concise, easy-to-read guide to the convenient global warming and sustainable new religion.
Yes.
This is the stuff that the media and governments do not want you to know. They do not want you to hear it, and today, here it is. So I hope we've helped you. It's certainly been really brilliant of you to give us your time, and I think we've all learnt a lot. And as we've all said, go and research this for yourself.
Yeah.
It's all out there. You just got to read, look up the internet, and you'll find that everything said here is documented and can all be followed up, and it's the hard, true facts. Thank you very much,
Thank
Reverend
you.
Foster.